And we are live. This is Dark Journalists. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas from tonight already. Of course, tonight I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, celebrate good times. Come on.
Mm-hmm.
So the Joannides files, some parts of the Joannides files, excerpts of the Joannides files have finally hit. And there's some 40 different documents. They don't say a whole lot, but they say one crucial, majorly crucial thing, which is that the Central Intelligence Agency was interacting through Joannides and the DRE with Lee Harvey Oswald. That is a crucial thing that investigators have tried to get the CIA to admit for now 62 years. And it shows the degree and the breadth and depth of the cover-up from the Central Intelligence Agency against the American people on the subject of the assassination of the 35th President of the United States, President John F. Kennedy, who they were at war with at the time. Now, the further piece, of course, is that the CIA participated in his assassination, and the players involved. You see, the connection now, the thing that can be drawn and that they've hung out for 60 years on, is that they knew about and had relations with Oswald. That's crucial. Now it's on the record. Now the Warren Commission is officially should be taken out of every school. And now all of the CIA obfuscation in those years and all those specials and everything else, that part all needs to go. What is interesting to me, though, is that even the people that are bringing this forward don't understand the ramifications of George Joannides and his role in the assassination. What they're saying is, oh, he was interacting and funding this group that was portraying Oswald and painting Oswald as, a pro-Castro zealot. This is very interesting because, of course, that's true. But what's happening there is that they are setting Oswald up as the patsy for the assassination before the assassination, which means they have foreknowledge of the assassination. And Joannides is in charge of the entire thing. He, in fact, is building, because he's their top psychological warfare operations officer. He's the top guy, and he is painting the Oswald legend from the beginning. And what we're going to find out is that crisscross there with Joannides and the UFO file through the figure of NSA Director Bobby Inman, who went on record talking about UFOs, of course, in the 1980s while he was Deputy Director of the CIA. And that is a very interesting story in itself. We're going to get deep, deep into that in tonight's special episode. And this is really something that could cause reverberations if the researchers and the Congress people and the whole thing know how to take it from, oh, hey, there's a CIA connection to Lee Harvey Oswald, which everyone who's in the know has known for many, many years, to astronaut pieces, the aerospace piece involved, NASA, the whole thing, the aerospace connection to the UFO file, which brings us to the clash about the exotic technology, which brings us to the assassination and the wave and wall of secrecy we've been living under ever since. We're going to get deep, deep into night. We're going to go about 90 minutes with you here tonight in this special presentation. It is the JFK Joannides and UFO file. This one, of course, we've been telling you about Joannides and pounding it home that his records were so, so crucial and that they were hanging on for dear life to this information. I'm going to also start the show off with this thing about what they use the shadowy figure thing when they're talking about Joannides. And I think it's interesting the way the media has handled this because they're blindsided. They don't know. They just know the standard thing. And so if this turns into, hey, there might have been some Cuban or mafia people involved, that's not going to do anything, actually. It will get rid of the stupid lone gunman story, which was always a lie from the start, perpetrated by the Johnson administration and the Central Intelligence Agency to cover up the entire thing. But their backup story was always the mafia and the Cubans. None of that stuff is. What is true is that the Central Intelligence Agency were engaged in a program to eliminate the chief executive in office. And what they wanted to do was set up Oswald as the perfect patsy for this. And he had all of the red background there. So there were aspects inside that program that wanted to, use this as a pretext to go against Cuba or the Soviet Union, whatever it happened to be, because he, after all, had been part of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee and had gone to the Soviet Union. But he had done all this under the direction of the Central Intelligence Agency. That's what they need to fess up to. That's the piece that we're going to get at tonight. And how does the aerospace piece work into that? Well, it works into it directly through the figure of Guy Bannister and Bobby Inman. All of that can come out, by the way, while they're doing these truth committees in Congress with Luna and Burchett. They are assigned to declassify documents and get to the bottom of the JFK assassination, the RFK assassination, and the UFO file.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, they can use sweeping powers. They can bring these people in. They can subpoena them, and they can grill them as witnesses the way the House Assassinations Committee did in 1979. This whole matter could have been over 40 years ago. It could have been over in 1963, of course. But even after the cover-up, when they came back, and there's just like a fundamental thing in the subconscious DNA of the American public and around the world that everyone just knew that they were being lied to about the Kennedy assassination because of the evidence and because of the way they pushed the story under and the long list of witness deaths involved in the Kennedy case, so that whenever there was, in fact, a story that would come out and that said, well, we're putting a new committee together, all these deaths would show up just before the committee had. In the case of the Luna Burchett committee that they have going now, I'm sending them a letter in relation to the information that they need to pursue now that it's on the record that George Joannides, in fact, was interfering with and interacting with Lee Harvey Oswald before the assassination. That's an earthquake inside of government and needs to be investigated, and the role of the Central Intelligence Agency and their deeper aspects, the covert wing, needs to be totally investigated in terms of the assassination links directly. And that's the crucial thing in the middle of all this. We need to get to the heart of it. I'm going to show them how that aerospace piece relates directly to it, just like we put the Joannides thing deeply before the public and have showed them things like the Blue program, which we put out a documentary out in 2023. And then finally, the government started talking about it in 2024. Of course, they just came out and started talking in the Wall Street Journal about Yankee Blue. That's another aspect of this blue umbrella that is the heart of the UFO file. We put it on the record in March of 2023. And then they came out and started to admit some of this in 2024 with Kona Blue and Yankee Blue and others. All of that whole piece now that we've been putting out, the reason we've been one step ahead on so many of these things is because of the deep research, because of the potent research, and because we're not in the business of being a pop click channel where you just grab at a headline or whatever. You can do the deep research and you can get to the bottom of it. In relation to the UFO in particular, you don't want to talk to counterintelligence agents and you don't want to talk to the CIA. And it was interesting. Just today, I was seeing this whole thing about, all of these UFO group people on Reddit were all excited because Jim Semivan had just given an interview. Well, Semivan set up the TTSA, and he was the one who put DeLong out there with Elizondo and that whole thing, which all turned out to be a sham. But they got a lot of information. They did a lot of data mining as a result of this. And what you need to remember when you're dealing with somebody like Semivan is that he was 25 years in the directorate at the CIA, top level. So, counterintelligence agents training all of their counterintelligence people that they have out there. So whenever we get around this UFO file piece, what they're doing, the CIA, instead of covering up now, is they're obfuscating and co-opting. So they're putting out their version of the whole thing, which is so far from the truth, all about a UFO threat and this whole thing. So this needs to serve as a way to show the deceptive tactics of the counterintelligence agencies and the deceptive tactics of the Central Intelligence Agency, especially when it pertains to President Kennedy's death, which happened now over 60 years ago, and they're still withholding evidence in relation to this. Now, with the Joannides file, though, we get a window on this, and I'm going to dive deep into it as we go. Before I go any further, I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, to go directly to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That is a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch through a lot of censorship that we see on our channel and just across the board on the web. This is the direct pipeline for you. And what you're going to get basically is all this information about the documentaries we have coming up for you. Fantastic documentaries. Of course, we have a major one on JFK, the final speech, which is all about JFK and the UFO file, and Lloyd BERKNER, who comes in tonight. This is a crucial aspect. While those congressional hearings are still open, and I know it might not even seem like it's on anyone's radar because they've done such a poor job of running those hearings for the task force that, they ran a Kennedy hearing that didn't go very far or very well. And every time they try to do a UFO one, all the people end up being sick and saying, sorry, teacher, we can't make it. We're sick. So, that whole thing has been going round and round. And so they don't know how to put Elizondo out there now that he got into a controversy with a false picture. So I think that they're redesigning that whole UFO threat piece. I'm going to get into that as part of tonight's look at this entire thing. And also NORAD comes into this as well. So we're going to get into all of it. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, what do you got?
Min says, good work, Dark Journalist. Vardian says, it's actually impressive how much I know because I've been following DJ since 2017.
Great.
Kelzilla says, we now have a direct link between Joannides and Oswald. And it's Alec with a C says, Grok references DJ if you ask about the Joannides file.
Oh, there we go. That's good.
That is awesome.
Well, here's the thing. Now, the figure of Joannides, we're going to get into him right now, because George Joannides is so mysterious that no one even knew that he existed. And he was born in Greece. He was brought over here at an early age to New York, went to school in Brooklyn, and he worked his way up through the ranks. And it's very interesting, too, that he goes over to Greece after he is getting along in his CIA career. And they have him doing this counterintelligence activities there. But it's also interesting to note that we kept an assassin group for certain types of executive action for the Central Intelligence Agency in a camp outside of Athens, Greece, in that period. So he may have a lot more crisscross when it comes down to it. But when he found himself in Miami, which was, the major center there for the Central Intelligence Agency, it was CIA headquarters. We had Langley was the main one, but the largest center of CIA activity with over 400 officers was right there at the Miami Jamwave station. And he was right in the heart of it as the top psychological warfare officer. And he was running the whole thing with the infamous CIA agent Theodore Shackley. And both of them were answering directly to Richard Helms now that Dulles had been thrown out. But Dulles had been very aware of their activities. And so when he goes and oversees, Dulles, who had been the sacred cow in intelligence as the leader for a decade, and who with his brother, John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State, basically ran the world after World War II, he drew up the statute, in fact, at Sullivan and Cromwell for the Central Intelligence Agency. So whenever you hear about the CIA and you hear about military purposes and things like that, remember this, that it was drawn up by a lawyer at a law firm in terms of what they were doing. And the firm was connected with what? International finance. That's really the role of the Central Intelligence Agency, is to represent those interests with our muscle on the intelligence side, on the military side, on the persuasion side, on the influence side. So it gives you kind of a major clue. And Dulles was in the heart of the planning for the assassination of President Kennedy. In fact, Kennedy had fired him after the Bay of Pigs. And we've gone through this in our documentaries and things so that we really get the details. The one I recommend the most right now is JFK, the final speech. And that's all about the UFO file. That documentary is available for you. I've linked it in the description of this channel. But Joannides is right in the heart of that documentary as well. And here's the thing. Now, Joannides, nobody knew anything about him. But there was a reporter at the Washington Post in the late 90s who was kicking around the JFK case, and he found some inconsistency in relation to looking at those early Cuban groups, the DRE in particular, which was a revolutionary group that was anti-Castro, and these exile groups who wanted to get back in there and repossess Cuba. Now, Cuba had gone through this revolutionary stage, but it was very odd because we had been in favor of Batista and all the rest. But if you really look deep into that history, Batista became particularly cruel, particularly like throwing his opposition leaders into prison. And it looks like we started to turn against him, not so much because we had this lofty vision of things, but because the skim out of his casinos, the skim out of his drug running, the skim out of his prostitution rings and things like that started to go down, not only for the mafia groups that were running them, but for the Americans and the intelligence groups that were facilitating the whole thing. And I think there was a decision that was reached because if you look at it, there's no way that Castro could have got in without the help of the Central Intelligence Agency. And in fact, in a few episodes, I've gone into that. Let's keep that in the back of our heads, that Castro isn't this runaway phenomenon. He's placed there just like so many things. But his actions, once he gets in and once he gets into tapping into that Soviet sphere of influence, that becomes maybe an unexpected problem for them. And it's interesting to note that Vice President Nixon had said, we frittered away, that Eisenhower frittered Cuba. This to me is very interesting, not recognizing just how hardcore that could go. And so once this takes place, they do in fact, there's a myth out there that immediately Castro gets rid of the casinos and all that. But no, he tried to have them operational just under a different system. Eventually, they do shut them out because they can't share power that way. But they're there for a while. He's cooperating with the mafia and things of that. So it's not, and what's interesting is he turns out as brutal as Batista because he is also doing the firing squad with his own opposition and all the rest. So he turns into, exactly what he is protesting against. There's a lot of unusual things about Castro we'll leave for now, but I will say this, that he was very aware when the Kennedy assassination that he was going to be set up as one of the fall guys for it. And there were groups inside that assassination situation that were saying to themselves, we need to do this executive action, but we need to do it as a way to, when we get the patsy, we need to be able to blame it on another country. And they wanted that face-to-face confrontation with Cuba and with the Soviet Union. There was another group in there that was saying, if we do that, obviously it would lead to war. So what we can do is when these people are going overboard handling the assassination, then all of the officials that are around government who don't want to go along with it, we can sit them down and say, hey, Oswald had all this relations, Cuba, the Soviet Union. You don't want World War III, blood on your hands of, 100 million Americans, do you? You're going to have to go along with this lie and just say it was Oswald and forget all about the other evidence. That's what they did. And in fact, Oswald is the phase 2 story in the vernacular of Professor Scott. The first story is Oswald did it as a member of a communist conspiracy, which, as we know, is ridiculous because Oswald wasn't even a communist. He worked for a right winger in New Orleans named Guy Bannister. And as we put on the record now, Bannister created the UFO file for the FBI. So Oswald is instantly in that aerospace wing of the entire assassination. And what they do is quite fascinating, actually, because Oswald, he comes forward as this figure and they say, well, he has this Cuban connection, this Soviet connection. Those stories come out first, and they're all run by this DRE group that George Joannides is propping up the money for. Very interesting to me that Joannides, as the skillful top psychological warfare officer, the same way he had gamed out different things at different countries for overthrow of governments and things of this nature, he's also working here. But the other people around that are working that, like Helms, Ned Lansdale, they're also experts at overthrowing governments. And when it comes to overthrowing this government, they're ready to do that as well for what they see as a national security threat through the figure of President Kennedy. We're going to get into just how did Joannides get to be such an influential figure in the middle of all this? And what does the release of partial file of Joannides mean? And what records do we need to go forward with? We're going to get into all that next in this special episode, JFK Joannides and the UFO file. I do want to check in with you, Miss Olivia, because I forgot to mention in the second half of tonight's program, we're going to be taking your questions. So we'll do a whole Q&A thing. You can ask those questions now for Miss Olivia, and she's going to be putting them together. What do you got?
Lancelot Link says, DJ, Joannides was photographed at the Ambassador Hotel when RFK was assassinated.
Yeah, it turned out that's a movie by Shane O'Sullivan, and it turns out that that's a misidentification, but there were CIA people at the Ambassador Hotel and other shadowy figures. But the one that they identified as Joannides, it did not turn out to be him. But I can put him in a lot of other very dicey places and situations as we go along tonight. We're going to see that one of the crucial things is when he gets his Career Intelligence Medal, it's right after coming out of retirement. And what happened was he ran the Oswald project. He created the legend. He helped with the assassination, and he helped the cover-up ever after. Then they had him doing other activities. But then those 70s JFK investigations started to hit hard. Pike Commission, the Church Committee, all these different things. By the time you get to the House Assassination Committee on Assassination, the Select Committee, you're looking at some pretty fierce investigators, researchers, senators, and Congress people. And it seems like the Kennedy secret is going to come out. They're either going to say the mafia killed him or the CIA did it. So they're loath to say the CIA was involved with any of it. So this mafia thing starts to take over. And you can see this in the literature and everything else. As a matter of fact, it's shocking how similar the literature is in the 1970s as it is now with the explanations. But what happens is quite fascinating because we're going into this period and they're looking at all this and they say, we need somebody because, the CIA has really been roughed up. They've switched out a lot of directors. George Bush tried to get in there and clean everything up for their side to be like, oh, we weren't involved in anything. And but Jimmy Carter fires him, so he's out. So the CIA doesn't have that protective gloss in the front, and they're getting in the spotlight. And a lot of different people are saying, we need to reform the CIA. So what they do when they realize all these dicey national security questions are going to come up about the assassination and the Central Intelligence Agency and how the CIA may have been involved in killing President Kennedy, they say, we need a guy who can shut it all down. How about the guy who invented it in the first place? And that is Joannides. And they rolled Joannides out. And the people who are running the committees say, now, whoever you give us over there at CIA, you cannot have it be anyone who was active in 1963. So no active agents from 63. And they're like, don't worry. This guy had nothing to do. He wasn't around any of it. In fact, he was running Jamwave, which is the biggest Miami CIA station. And that's the biggest station in the world for the Central Intelligence Agency. It was at the time, the Miami station. So, in fact, they got the main guy in the heart of the assassination to handle all of those things, just like they had Dulles do it in the Warren Commission in 1964. After, the Kennedy assassination, they put the guy that he fired on the committee to handle the entire thing. And when you go deep into the Warren Commission, what you find out is most people who were associated with it said it's actually the Dulles Commission because Warren didn't actually do very much. And Dulles showed up for, a lot more things than Warren did. So he controlled the intelligence leads. He knew all about the relationship of Oswald with the CIA and, the Joannides piece and all the rest of it. But he also knew that they were using Oswald as Nazi. That's the crucial thing. So when we get into the committees, what we're looking for are these patterns. And the next pattern that you get is this House Assassination Committee. So their version of Dulles is to put Joannides. So the man in the shadows who did it all, he becomes the liaison. Now, later on, there's a lot of people who were associated with that committee to go back and look in the 1990s and say, "Oh, he lied to us," you know?
And they're shocked.
And well, what they say is, if we knew who he was, we would have been interrogating him, not taking his word about this agent or that agent. So they were able to bamboozle all those committees. And the answers that we as Americans and around the world should have got about President Kennedy, even before a lot of people were born, uh, you know, would have been the truth. If it hadn't come out in the 1960s, it would have come out in the 1970s. So you would have had all the answers by 1979 and that committee. Instead, more obfuscation, and Joannides was at the heart of the obfuscation. But Joannides it's a very insidious thing to bring him back out, considering he was the shadow figure in the first place. Now, let's get into what they have let out there over at CIA through Director Ratcliffe under the executive order that Trump signed about all of the JFK assassination files being declassified. Now, I will say this. There are all kinds of stipulations in relation to this. For example, the CIA, if you don't demand all of the files relating to the Blue program at NASA and the secret space program and these things, then they can get away with never showing that to the public and saying, oh, it has nothing to do with the Kennedy assassination. So when he asks for those records and says, you have to declassify all those records, they can say, well, NASA doesn't have anything to do with that, so just forget about it. But if we show, as we have on this program, that the aerospace aspect is at the heart of it, especially the exotic technology piece with the UFO file, that is at the very heart of the assassination. And it's also at the heart of what the moves that President Kennedy is doing to consolidate the space agencies so they don't split off in these two separate directions, one covert and one public. That is how you get into the assassination. That's how you break the gridlock of the whole thing. And we've put forward those facts. And those are the facts that I'm ready to give to the congressional committees that are investigating this. That's how you get the answer. Instead, what they're doing is they're obfuscating it and saying, oh, here's records about people that were active during the assassination. And, as we know, they held these records for 60 some odd years. But what they've been able to do is be very selective about it. So what I would do is I would go back to all of them and say, give us all of your secret studies relating to the space program that President Kennedy was involved in, so that they can't say, well, that's not assassination related. Just say, give us any aerospace document and secret directive by President Kennedy. That's how you break through the gridlock on all. So, but we can celebrate the small steps, and they are small steps, let me tell you. But nonetheless, the public does get on the record that the Central Intelligence Agency was interacting with Oswald before the assassination. That is historic on one side. So here's one of the headlines that came off of that. CIA admits shadowy officer monitored Oswald before JFK assassination. New records revealed. Okay, that's just from today. Now, this is how the word is getting out about this. Now, keep in mind that word shadowy. Okay, I'm going to bring us back. Here's a little Mandela effect on the spot. And it's Washington, D.C., Thursday, January 15th, 1976. And we're in the Washington Post, and it says, Oswald's CIA trails crossed. Shadowy figure emerges. Well, gee, we have a shadowy figure where finally gets revealed in 2025. They had this down in 1976. So why did we have to wait almost 50 years just to get this? So they were close. They were close. They got obfuscated. They got thrown off track, and the CIA had to be reborn in this even more covert tack in order to take on, things like Iran-Contra and the Nicaraguan Contras and this whole thing that they were doing in the 1980s and the drug wars and William Casey. They went back to all the same techniques, and they threw out all of the transparency efforts. Wait. But nonetheless, I'm going to read this story from 1976 because in a way it's almost more revealing. And then we're going to get into what they have been able to put on the record about Joannides. What else you got there?
CC says Miami CIA in the hot zone.
Exactly. Yeah. And that was the biggest, all the agents, all the activities were there. And it is interesting because, all of the covert activity that they did in relation to Cuba, um, there are a number of different countries, Central American countries, South American countries, that we have gone into and meddled with, etc. The kind of focus that they had for Cuba is like nothing you've ever seen. And it gets us deep into conversations we've had on this show about the hot zone, etc. That there's something very special about Cuba in relation to a little island, some 90 miles off our shores here. And they almost bring us to the brink of World War III in October of 1962, when President Kennedy backtracks the world from a nuclear confrontation through skillful, very skillful statesmanship, statecraft, and diplomacy. And this is a very special quality, as you can see in the world the way it is. It's lacking statecraft in a dramatic sense. But President Kennedy saved the whole world from a nuclear exchange in that period. So you can see, again, it's Cuba. There's something about Cuba becomes a flashpoint. Senate investigators, this is from the Post in 76, are trying to untangle a perplexing coincidence that linked Lee Harvey Oswald with a longtime CIA agent who published a Latin American newsletter as a cover for his intelligence work. The former agent, William George Gaudet, received a Mexican tourist permit with a serial number just preceding that of the one issued to Lee Harvey Oswald, September 17th, 1963. This is the visa now to go to Mexico City. Of course, Oswald, there's no proof he ever went to Mexico City. But the person that they sent there, imitating Oswald, he would go into the Russian embassy and say, I'll do anything for you guys. Just let me go over there. And he'd meet with very dicey figures, Soviet embassy. And then he'd go over to the Cuban embassy and demand a visa and just say, I have to get there, and freak out. So he's remembered. And that's just 6 weeks before the assassination, so that they can, whoever's setting up that portion of the op can say, oh, see, he wanted to get back with his Russian and Cuban pals. He's a communist. In a television interview this week, Gaudet, who's now living in Mississippi, said he knew Oswald by sight at the time, although he cannot recall if Oswald was in the Mexican consulate in New Orleans. Now, this is weird. I'm going to show you how weird this is, and how this whole thing about, we're getting headlines now about Joannides and the CIA. This story from 1976 had this agent in it in New Orleans, who actually knew Oswald by sight and admitted it. The visa that Oswald went to get, he goes to get a visa and he gets a certain number. Then the person before him has a certain number. They identify her. The person who gets the visa right after him, it says, oddly enough, there's no record of who that is. A24084. No record. Then, if you see, his number is 24085. So the no record is a CIA rub out, because they knew that this guy was going right along to Mexico City to track with this imposter. Now, what happens is the FBI doesn't do as good of a job, and they're keeping an eye on Oswald. So in their records, they keep the fact that Oswald goes and that the CIA goes and gets his visa right after him. So the CIA obfuscation thing, which you can see how they just take the record out and it just says no record. But the FBI, since they weren't communicating on the assassination at that point with the CIA, are basically, they're tracking their own Oswald thing, and they have it. They have the number. So they know that it's this guy. So Gaudet, he gets his visa to Mexico like basically a minute and a half after Oswald, from New Orleans to Mexico City. And he not only knows Oswald by sight, but he's already been working for 22 years for the CIA. So the person who gets their visa to go to Mexico City right after Oswald is a hardcore covert operator for the CIA.
Wow.
That's already on record in 1976.
Mm-hmm.
That's the shadowy figure piece. And see also how the CIA tried to obfuscate it. So if the New York Times, the Washington Post, any of those, even mainstream journalists try to go in, they would find no record of a 24084. So that's just how they control things. And they can also forge things into the record. For example, when E. Howard Hunt was being sent to prison during the Watergate affair, they were grilling him and they said, if you really want a long term here, you can keep on holding on to your silence, or you can tell us about these 10 things that we think that you did. You can confirm or deny. One of those things was forging a cable that implicated President Kennedy in the death of the DM brothers, who were running Vietnam in 1963, 3 weeks before Kennedy was assassinated. They're assassinated by the Central Intelligence Agency, who kill both brothers, and they install a new leadership. Now, Kennedy is very unnerved by that whole situation. And he's like, the CIA has gone way beyond anything that we said to do. We would never order their assassination. Now, what's going to happen in Vietnam? Well, it's quite interesting because Hunt, under the direction of the CIA director, says, he gets this order that says you have to forge a cable that says, I'm President Kennedy, order you to assassinate the DM brothers. And he does it with all the official stamps and all the rest of it. And that's the thing that's in the record. So until Watergate hits, that record is in there, and it makes President Kennedy looks like he ordered the assassination of the DM brothers, but it never happened. He just forged the cable. And then as part of his plea deal, he wrote, I forged that cable for the CIA because they wanted to implicate Kennedy. And he said, why, when he was getting questioned, the Senate committee person said, why were they trying to implicate Kennedy in the assassination of the DM brothers? And they said, he said, it was over the Catholic vote. It was to make the Catholics take a second look at him or something. It was this ridiculous explanation. No, the reason was, they wanted to change and forge that record about Vietnam, that President Kennedy was, had assassinated the leaders and got us into Vietnam and that whole thing. In fact, Kennedy had orders lined up to pull out all of our troops in 1965. He had already started the process by pulling out 1,000 troops. There's going to be no Vietnam War under Kennedy, just like he wouldn't have a Cuban War. So they keep trying to get him into these flashpoints, and he's not going for it. So you have a whole shadow government operational here. Now, people who study the deep state do a fantastic job. They understand, and they do great work, very granular work with a lot of nested details about the government and all the rest of it. And that can include drug running. It can include gun running. It can include those dicier black budget aspects. The thing that they don't have is the UFO file. They don't want to pay any attention to. Now, here's a big gap that we have, which is on the UFO side, they don't have deep state knowledge. They don't have the research facility to do it. And, the only people who have any political knowledge in the UFO field tend to be very biased in like a left-wing fashion, thinking only left-wingers can bring disclosure. So, you get some kind of a lot of stupidity out of that. But in general, the UFO field doesn't have any kind of expertise, doesn't have the deep research, doesn't understand how the government operates in relation to removing leaders, executive action, and all the rest of it. It has a little bit of the the government needs to give us that truth, but it goes along with, just like the thing with Semivan today. He's this big CIA guy, and all those people on, Reddit UFO or whatever, they're all waiting for Semivan's proclamation about UFOs. So, those people, and it's most of that hooked up field, like Corbell and the other people who've gone along with it, even people that used to be good, like Knapp and all the rest, they're all sucked into that whirlpool of CIA activity. CIA counterintelligence control the UFO file. What you can do when you look at this subject, you can take that deep state knowledge and you can bring in the UFO file, which we try to do on this show. If you bring those two things together, you're going to get that very, very clear picture of what's operational here actually in the background. Because you can incorporate the drug part, you can incorporate the black budget part, you can incorporate the CIA executive action, intel control piece, surveillance, etc., with the exotic technology part. If you leave that out, you're hanging out there in the wind, because that's a crucial aspect. In fact, Sarbarker, who was the physicist that they rubbed out of history, said it was the top national security secret of the United States government. Well, there's many major figures now, including people that have come on this program, who've put it on the record that Kennedy was killed over the UFO file. That's what we're going to put forward for you next and understand how Joannides fits into that and how a very crucial person now in his 90s, Bobby Inman, is very privy to details relating to Joannides and should be questioned now as part of that task force D-class committee. We're going to get into how to do that in the next segment. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is JFK Joannides and the UFO file. We're going to be taking your questions here shortly. And I still have a lot of information to get for you, but we're going to do, it's going to be a shorter show tonight because it's a special report. I do want to thank everyone for all your great comments and everything. I put out on our Twitter feed some of those clips that we've done on Joannides, and it is remarkable the amount of information. But we brought forward so much of this, and the Joannides story had sort of percolated in the background among few JFK researchers here and there, or whatever. But the full impact of the thing, especially its relation to the UFO file, which they're not interested in, like the JFK researchers and that whole thing, they're after very different, almost objectives. It's sort of like a historical nitpicking thing, and they're very worried about being perceived as conspiracy anything, and they still think that there's a mainstream media that will kind of grant them access or something, but it's not
Or
true.
who cares about the truth?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So, we're in a weird situation with that. I can tell you that those people are trying to kind of have it both ways. They want to be able to go before a committee and go, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. But then everything that they're laying out alludes to a conspiracy. So, you got to kind of choose one or the other
Yeah,
at a
you know what
certain
it is?
point.
They want legitimacy in an
Yes.
illegitimate world.
Yeah,
And that's the
right.
problem. They need to update their software.
Yeah.
It's like it's not legitimate.
Right.
Maybe it never was.
It is actually old-timey
Mhm.
legitimacy, in fact, like I can appear on NBC News,
Mhm.
But and that's part of a problem too, which is they don't go far enough. And that's where dark journalism comes in. What we can do, you see, with something like the Joannides information is show Joannides' connection with Oswald. Joannides' connection with Oswald and Oswald's connection with aerospace. And then Joannides' connection with Bobby Inman and Inman's connection with aerospace. And why is he getting the Career Intelligence Medal? It's related to saving the UFO file by creating the Oswald project. Those are the things that we can put on the record. And we can do it with the help of the deep, deep research that we've done in the background on figures like Lloyd Berkner, for example, who I did a whole documentary on and was in fact the physicist that President Kennedy was going to meet on his way to meet at the Dallas Trade Mart to make some major announcement that involved the flying in of the flag from Air Force One. This is what was going on here. It was this skirmish over the exotic technology, how to share that first with the Russians and then the broader public, so that in that period of the 1960s, you would have seen much more of a cooperative piece and much more of a transparency coming in from a second Kennedy administration. What you got instead was war, and laying out this whole drug thing, using America as, the kind of putting drugs on the doorstep of America the way they had done it in other countries. And these forces, which were not, particularly large. This is one of the things that President Kennedy noticed when he got into office was the incredible impact that a very small cadre of CIA agents had in running the policy of the United States. But you see, their masters weren't the government of the United States. Their masters had to do with, as I said, international finance and the companies that they would represent. So I've made a very simple explanation. If in Uzbekistan, a company like Exxon was like, well, we want to put all these oil fields there in Uzbekistan, but we're really worried about the political situation. Like, what if we invest all this money and all these refineries and things, and then some strongman takes over? We'll be screwed and we'll have wasted all this money. So the CIA goes in there and they control who the leader is. And then that leader's very American friendly. Then the corporation can go in there, et cetera. Okay, that's just a very simplified version of the thing. But that's what the Central Intelligence Agency was doing, which is why their mandate it got, you know, screwed up almost immediately in 1947 because the original idea was give the president different choices based on the intelligence and spying networks that you have for international hotspots, flashpoints, and things that are going on geopolitically. What happened instead was there's a group in there when we started off with the Central Intelligence Agency that was already out of control coming out of this post-war thing. They had just fought World War II and they were used to fighting dirty. And, they were that really kind of undercover paramilitary wing. And, they had this very innocuous title going in there. And that whole group that came in and took over the Central Intelligence Agency, they were the hardcore ones. And it was interesting. If you look at some of the literature, very early on, Truman is saying about them, get them under control, get them under the actual umbrella of the intelligence agency part, and get them out of the business of, switching elections around or blowing up trains or whatever it is they're doing at running drugs, and really move them under this wing of presidential intelligence. So instead, that wing takes over the Central Intelligence Agency. They become the dominant wing. And by the 1950s, in situations like Guatemala with our Benz and things like that, they are able to affect changes in government without, real American boots on the ground for it. So they're seen as a benefit. Eisenhower's looking at this and saying, well, this has some possibilities. But by the end of his administration, he's totally against it. And that's where he gives the big military industrial complex speech. And he tells Kennedy, not only are these guys out of control, but he alludes to the fact that you have to watch them in relation to exotic technology. That's the flashpoint. So you have all this coming in the door when Kennedy gets in there in 1960 in the election, and he comes into office in 61. And from 61 until his assassination in 63, it is a push-pull between what he's trying to do and what the agency is trying to do. They're trying to dominate the world by force, Pax Americana, as he called it. And he's trying to create cooperative situations. Now, we also have a lot of difficulties going on in the world because we have a major enemy in the Soviet Union. So he's trying to figure out, we can't come to a point where we're at war because we'll exchange nuclear weapons. And so Kennedy is working in the background very, very slowly to create a different world. And he's telling Americans, you can do this. And the most crucial thing is that we put an end to war before war puts an end to mankind. And he really understood this. He was a great student of history. One of the things that occurs to him, and it's quite kind of a genius move, is to share the UFO file with the Russians. This is something I put on the record, which, there were vague allusions in the historical document to the fact that he wanted to do a joint moon mission. And I went back and actually found his speeches at the UN in September of that year, openly announcing it. And then if you go into a lot of Sergei Khrushchev, who's Khrushchev's son, a lot of what he had to say about his dad and Kennedy talking in the background, outside of the influence of the KGB, outside of the influence of the CIA, they were talking about joint space missions. They were talking about sharing technology and sharing the UFO file. This is the crucial thing. So when we've had people like Watergate lawyer Douglas Caddy come on this program and say, his friend E. Howard Hunt, the top CIA operator, says Kennedy was killed because he wanted to share the UFO file. We've had these other officials come on board and give these kind of deathbed confessions just recently. So, they're starting to catch up to the vision that we've laid out there. But the Joannides piece is right in the heart of this because he's representing, again, this aspect involved with aerospace. That's what we're going to get into next. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. I want to remind you in this special Sunday night broadcast that if you're new here, if it's your first time here, go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That is a free newsletter, and it keeps us in touch through all of the massive censorship, especially dealing with kind of hot button issues, as you might expect in dark journalism. And what you'll get are some great previews of documentaries and the docuseries we have coming up course, JFK and the UFO file, and also Pyramid X and The Craze in the Hot Zone. These are the really major productions that we're doing and putting things on the record way before the public is catching up with them. And, we have a number of things that we've put on the record in relation to this. Now we're starting to see the headlines catch up with some of this. And this is a great opportunity to get some real answers out of Congress, and also maybe to boot that counterintelligence force out of dominating the UFO file discourse. This is all very crucial. So it's all there in that newsletter. Make sure you go to darkjournalists.com and sign up for it. It's free. Stand up and be counted. Make sure you're on that list. Miss Olivia, what do you got?
VixTech says the CIA inherited Gestapo agents. Harvardian says Nazis in Washington, Galen organization taking over CIA. And, and Lancelot Link says, DJ, do we know who reported to whom in the CIA during the JFK RFK years? For example, did Joannides or Hunt report to David Atlee Phillips or George Herbert Walker Bush or ...
Yeah, it's interesting. Joannides did work with Bush. Now, this is fascinating. It's later. And remember, officially, Bush doesn't become a public figure and all that, but we know in the background that there are documents related to George Bush. And they're like, oh, no, that's a different George Bush. Well, whatever, It's interesting. One day I had a rollicking conversation with Jim Mars, and he said, the agent that they said was George Bush, they actually tracked him down, and he said, oh, no, I wasn't the George Bush that they were talking about. So it was a different George Bush. But a couple of interesting things. First of all, these are the actual documents that mean something from the Joannides release. And remember, those are excerpted releases. We still don't have the full Joannides file, but these pieces demonstrate the thing that was being sought, which was his direct relationship through the DRE with Oswald. And here's a couple of highlights now. On August 9th, 1963, more than 3 months before the assassination in November 22nd, 4 DRE operatives got into a scuffle with Oswald in New Orleans when he was passing out pro-Castro Fair Play for Cuba Committee pamphlets. Now remember, the DRE is an anti-group. They're funded thousands of dollars every month by the CIA, over $50,000 a month. And Joannides is under an alias, calling himself Howard. That's how he gets caught later, how people find out that there was somebody else operating there. And that's a very interesting story in itself. On August 21st, 1963, Oswald debated DRE activists on local TV, providing more media attention to him as a communist. Now, what happens is he gets into this fight, and Oswald kind of walks into this. So first of all, Oswald is going to this DRE group, and he's saying, I'm an ex-Marine. I can help you blow up bridges that Castro's going over. You can get rid of him. I can help you with the whole thing. I'm your main man. And they're like, good. This sounds great. We're being funded by CIA, and, we can really make this happen. And he's like, great, I want to join your movement. So then, as the story goes, they're walking down there by the World Trade Center where Clay Shaw is sitting there sipping white wine and stuff while Oswald is outside handing out pamphlets. And they see him, and it says, Fidel, Viva Fidel, and all this stuff, all pro-Castro. So they start to fight with him. And as a result of that fight, he goes to jail in New Orleans. Now, this takes place in the summer before the assassination. So it's a crucial snapshot in all this. And again, it's related to the DRE, which Joannides is running. So Joannides has staged this probably in order to get Oswald to have a record, first of all, and second of all, to get on TV to be like, I'm a Marxist, and all the rest. Now, it's also interesting to note that when this is taking place, Oswald has a session. He requests that the FBI come talk to him. Well, that's pretty odd just for a guy handing out leaflets on the street, right? So the FBI's officer's name is Quigley. He comes in and he has a 3-hour conversation with Oswald. Well, When you go into jail for a minor offense like that, a little scuffle on the street, you really require 3 hours with the FBI? Kind of interesting. So, what happens later when they try to follow up with this? When Oswald is grabbed, they're like, "Hey, Quigley, where are the notes from the interview that you had with him?" He said, "Oh, I destroyed the notes." So, nobody even knows what was exchanged there, but there's a record of him calling in Quigley. So, the FBI and Oswald are immediately there's a track record there. One of the beautiful things I think that Professor Scott did, and of course, he wrote all the deep state books, coined the term, and he's appeared in this program many times. But what he did was he figured out that actually, as part of his undercover activities, that Oswald was an industrial security, and that's why they have him doing things like, "Hey, adopt an alias and then order these rifles to your mailbox because we want to test out how people are ordering rifles through the mail." Okay, so he's an industrial agent. He's going to do this. He sets up the name, Alec Heidel. He gets the P.O. box. He orders the rifle to. When they grab him for the assassination, they can say, "Oh, look at this guy. He was using an alias. He ordered the rifle that killed the president. Book him." You know? So you have to see how very carefully those things were laid down in the first place. And remember that Joannides is psychological warfare. So when he goes into warfare, he needs to convince the enemy on a lethal basis that about their actions. They need to make the wrong actions because he's giving them the wrong psychological impression. That's the role of Joannides. That's his job, as it were. So when he goes and he is doing this in relation to Oswald, he needs to set up all the various steps that are going to make him look like he's guilty when they grab him on November 22nd. And of course, they're going to snuff him out before he has a chance to really say anything, as we know. So now we have headlines like this: CIA admits covering up Oswald links before the assassination. This is mainstream now. So now what you can do with this is take that committee, as I've mentioned, the task force committee, and force them into a deeper acknowledgement, which is CIA lied to you. Therefore, you need all of their records pertaining to the aerospace program. That's the key, because Joannides, after all, gets his medal from Bobby Inman, who's in the heart of UFO technology and also in the heart of exotic tech. And that comes in later. Also, not only is he acting director of the CIA, deputy director, and NSA director, an admiral in the Navy and all the rest, but he also becomes a big shot at SAIC. All kinds of technology going on there. And one of the very interesting things about Inman, which I've said before, is he expressed an interest in the 1980s of engaging with different UFO researchers about disclosure, even on the record, saying, yes, we know a great deal about that.
Can I punctuate something here?
Yes.
So I think what you just said is really important, is that
Yes.
acknowledging that the CIA has lied
Yeah.
is so important, because then you can treat them as adversarial versus being an ally
Yes.
to disclosure.
Absolutely.
And that changes everything.
There's no question about it. And also, like Radcliffe, who we have in there now through the Trump administration, he might have a Stansfield Turner problem. Stansfield Turner is the CIA director who took over for George Bush under the Carter presidency. The story goes that Carter went to Bush and said, "I want your UFO files because I made a campaign promise," and you'll see it in a Playboy interview that Carter gave in 1976 when he's running, that he's going to be transparent about UFOs. Very interesting. There was a wave of UFO stuff going on there, and in 1977, the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out, and Carter's like, I want to get into this. As a matter of fact, I've seen a UFO. I made a UFO report when I was governor. And Bush says, "No, you don't have any need to know that, and we deal with this very selectively with presidents. I'm not going to give it to you." And so Carter fires Bush and brings in Stansfield Turner, who was like a friend of his from college. And Stansfield Turner does run the CIA. Technically, he's the leader, but can't do anything because the people and the network inside the Central Intelligence Agency doesn't really work officially. They don't really answer to the director or the president. They answer to their network. And that's part of the problem. And it's been a problem since then. So this thing about now Ratcliffe is in there. Well, can he even clean it up? He can get some records out, but if you want to really get to the heart of the whole thing, you're going to have to show the essence of the Central Intelligence Agency's participation in the assassination. So, they have knowledge of Oswald and they interact with Oswald. That's on the record now. Well, researchers have said that for 60 years, but now the government has acknowledged it. It's just like, it's almost like it's too late in a sense on a lot of these things, for the government to have a clean bill of health. It's not going to happen. If the Central Intelligence Agency is found culpable for assassinating President Kennedy, there's no going back for the CIA. The CIA becomes a different thing. And this is the nature of the problem and why they've held on their own secrecy in relation to the matter. If you go to the heart of it, though, you've got the who here in relation to the CIA, but the why is the crucial aspect. And Kennedy, saw them as an invisible government out of control, handling things and pushing the public government to do their will. And this is where the clash took place. And it's an acknowledged historical clash, but they put it in terms of like, oh, well, Kennedy had a different vision for the future than the CIA and they didn't get along. Well, no, they saw him as a national security threat because of their plans, because he had planned to spread independence and freedom. This is where he was coming from. And he had let them down by not getting into various wars in places like Laos, in places like Vietnam and Cuba. So once you get into the UFO piece, when he's saying, not only do I not want to have a war with the Russians, I want to share the UFO file with them. That's it. He's the national security threat. We're going to get rid of him. There are other people, who put things on the record about the currency issue and the Federal Reserve. Look, that's absolutely right. And he did. Kennedy went into these different things and said, what can the president actually do? And how can the president reestablish and push back that control of the secret architecture of the government, including the exotic technology in the UFO file, and bring it back under the executive branch? Well, when we see things going on like what's happening now with President Trump, there's no question with Space Force and with some of these other pieces that he also is trying to figure out, how do I get that infrastructure back under presidential control? And I'll tell you that I think a lot of forces in that deep state, whether you like President Trump or not, a lot of those forces in the deep state don't like Trump because of the presence of his uncle in the background there, because his uncle knew all about the UFO file, because he was mentored by Vannevar Bush at MIT. And, we've done the specials and everything else, the documentaries going into the Tesla piece with Trump. And that is literally on the record about his uncle, et cetera, and the exotic technology that Tesla was doing. When you're playing with those types of cards, you have a lot of leverage. So they've done a lot of things that they haven't done before. They've raided, Trump's house. They've tried to assassinate Trump. So that mechanism, you see, is ever active. The deep state is right there. And if they pull back at different times or they try to figure out how to get leverage and how to get popularity again, this is kind of a stage where they're doing some of that post-COVID, et cetera. But going back directly now to this case, here's what we have that came out in the file that Ratcliffe was able to get out, whether he's being Stansfield Turnered or not. Special Agent in Charge, District Field Office. Okay, January 17th, 1963. Okay, so we're talking 11 months later, President Kennedy's assassinated. But before that, Special Agent in Charge, the subject is George Joannides. Quote, this is what they're saying, the field office. You requested as Office of Origin to obtain an alias backstopped the District of Columbia driver's permit with a captioned subject through your established contact. The captioned subject is George E. Joannides. The subject is identified as follows. His alias, Howard Mark Gebler. This is the name that he used. He's a white male, July 5th, 1922, Alexandria, Virginia, 5'8", 180 pounds, black hair, brown eyes. and they give a phony address. His occupation is an attorney, and he wears glasses. So they have the whole setup there, so no one's ever going to question Howard Gebler. He's got his alias set up by the CIA. Now that record is out. So Gebler is the Howard that was funding the DRE, giving them thousands of dollars. He comes directly CIA money into the Cuban revolutionary group, and the DRE is the ones who were dealing with Oswald and were running ads against Oswald saying, oh, he's a communist, he's a friend of Fidel Castro and all that. And they're the ones who right after the assassination are like, hey, look, we have all these television debates with Oswald. He's a commie, get Castro now. But here, something very interesting I want to point out to you is the actual recommendation for the Career Intelligence Medal after he blocks and deflects the House Assassination Committee on the Select Committee on Assassination in 1979. He's done all this. He's pushed back. He's pretended to be a different person, and he's lied, and he's gotten all of the research from that committee obfuscated. And also, he's been able to bamboozle the people who were in charge of that because they said don't have anybody who was operational for the CIA in '63. Instead, they got the main guy who created the Oswald project, as I mentioned. So it says it's recommended that George Joannides be awarded the Career Intelligence Medal for his more than 28 years of devoted and effective service for your agency. Mr. Joannides was born July 5th, 1922 in Athens, Greece, and emigrated to New York City 23 with his family. He obtained an AB degree in liberal arts from City College of New York and an LLS degree from St. John's University Law School in Brooklyn in 1947. At the very top, you might find these initials quite interesting. We've got the recommendation coming from Bobby Inman. B.R. Inman. Bobby Ray. That's our man. Now, Bobby Ray, not only is he very, very knowledgeable in that deep state aspect, as I said, director of NSA, acting director of CIA. He's the one who gives the career medal to Joannides because Joannides, after all, saved the Oswald project. He saved the UFO file with the Oswald project, which gave them a patsy for the JFK assassination. And then they moved directly into position. Here, he's just obfuscated all the JFK committees. He's bamboozled them all. And Inman is giving him the award basically for saving that UFO file. Remember, Inman, as I said, will talk publicly about disclosure and knowledge of UFOs and where different people can find information on it, and was a major part of this whole piece about it. And not only that, but he suggested that the government knew exactly what the UFOs were. That's crucial. Joannides here getting the Lifetime Career Achievement is a major deal because what we can see is it's his efforts at obfuscating the role of the CIA in the Kennedy assassination that's getting him this incredible accolade, which is rare, by the way. Not something that they give out to officers. And we're going to get into now some of the background on how this works, and then we're going to take your questions. How does that sound? Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's JFK Joannides and the UFO File. It's great to have you here on Sunday night. And we just did a great show with Walter Bosley, of course, dealing with NIMSA, early airship development around the UFO file. That's a great episode, and it was great to have him on. Then this came out of the blue, and yet we knew it was coming because there were little hints here and there. But again, what they've let out as excerpts is so crucial. Even though they're excerpts and they're not the full thing, it's a crucial aspect because what it can do, those committees, if they're worth anything, can pivot here and say, give us all of the aerospace connections to the JFK assassination directly in your files. And here's where we want you to go. And they can put people like Inman under oath saying, why did they give Joannides this reward for obfuscating the details around the Kennedy assassination? That would be a D-class. the thing they have going on is a sideshow where UFO witnesses call in sick from, North Carolina and say, I can't make it. Now, this is
Why
the
don't we
actual.
just do a petition to get everybody to sign up to get Bobby Ray Inman testify?
Yeah, well, that's a big part of it. That's a big part of it. Part of the
Well, let's do it.
part of the letter I'm sending to them,
Mhm.
and they'll get that letter. I'm going to send it tomorrow, but I'm going to put the full text of it out on social media so everyone can read it. But it goes right to the heart of it, which is how do you get that information so that people like Luna and Burchett, if they're serious, they'll have the ability to do it. It goes on the idea that they're serious, but they don't know how to get that information out of the government. Now they are dealing with, high-level officials and things like that, so they're being deflected from things that they may want to get. Now, Central Intelligence Agency citation, George Joannides. In recognition of his exceptional achievement with the Central Intelligence Agency for more than 28 years, right, and especially that period between 63 and 80, where participates in the Kennedy assassination and then in blocking everything related to the Kennedy assassination. Assignments of increasing responsibility at headquarters, the domestic field, and overseas. With outstanding linguistic skills, area knowledge, expertise, and specialized operational activity, psychological warfare, and superb managerial technique truly earned him the respect and admiration of superiors and colleagues. Joannides' overall career performance and dedication to duty uphold the highest traditions of the operations director, reflecting credit on himself and the federal service. That's what they gave him for creating the Oswald. And it's interesting to note that they have this crisscross with Inman, who himself is set to become the full CIA director after all this. He's acting director at that point. But he runs into a snag because, interestingly enough, in the Reagan administration, he becomes deputy CIA director, thinking he's going to be CIA director. And by the time Clinton rolls around, Clinton says, I want you to be CIA director, and then withdraws rather quickly and says, I'm not going to nominate you after all.
What do you think?
There's all kinds of speculation about it, but my
That's
guess.
weird because Clinton obviously, supposedly loved JFK.
Yes. I think it's because he didn't think Inman was going to tell him the truth. And he did end up getting another guy who was very UFO savvy, James Woolsey. But Woolsey, it's interesting to note that Clinton never met him except for when he was appointed. Clinton never had any sessions with him in his presidency, which is pretty wild. He's also the one who started to come out and say, oh, my friend was stopped in midair flying a private aircraft 30,000 feet. A UFO, froze him in midair and did this whole suspended animation thing. Woolsey is a very tricky character in the background there. Like Semivan, they are these CIA people pulling out their version of the UFO file, and that's the one that's been dominant. And, before we even started tonight's show, there was a big flash across all of social media that the new movie about Bob Lazar is coming out. Oh, yeah. Well, that's a weird thing, too, because so many of the Lazar things are discredited as well. So they're staying in this particular lane on it. Of course, next summer, Steven Spielberg movie about Lou Elizondo, well, that might be in trouble now because Elizondo looks like a fool for putting out false UFO photos. Or did he do that on purpose? You see how the counterintelligence thing works? Very strange. That's why once we identified Chris Mellon as directing the UFO whistleblower circus and put it on the record, and that was based on the conversation with David Grush, who was the heart. He's the UAP advisor to Dan Burleson right now. And he told me point blank, I can't, Chris Mellon has approval. He has to approve of what I'm doing or I can't do it. I can't come on your show. We can talk, but I can't go publicly with you because Chris Mellon, there'll be hell to pay from him and his family. Well, what kind of control is that? What the hell are you talking about? What are you talking about? So all your UFO testimony is BS? Or you can't say certain things to certain people? because of a billionaire DOD official who's the mayor of Area 51 is running and has all the marionette strings on these UFO whistleblowers? Is that what you're saying? So you can see that's the actual situation we're in. The rest of the stuff is BS. But you've got the potent dark journalist take on it. And I got it firsthand from Grush. And we had those conversations, whole interaction, documented, everything else. But I'll say this about Grush is I think he was a real whistleblower who got in over his head. And Mellon was like, hey, I control you. We're the mob. We're the ones who control the whistleblowers. You can't get through this system except through me. And that he went along with that. He was like, okay, well, you tell me what to do and I'll do it, boss. That's the problem. This is what you're up against when you deal with it. I want you to keep that in mind. Okay. Let's do this here. Admiral Bobby Ray Inman, the former director of the National Security Agency and Naval Intelligence, from whom Bob Auschler obtained guidance on the acquisition of sensitive information relating to extraterrestrial craft in the possession of the United States government. Timothy Good put that on record in relation to his work with Bob Auschler. Or Exler, I guess is how they actually say it. Let's do a little aerospace dance here for a few minutes, and then we'll take your question. How's that? What do you got over there?
Sick of the BS wanted to know, when did Joannides pass away?
In 1990, and he passed away in Houston, Texas, where he was, the home of the Del Shao paintings. But I'm sure he did a great job for the CIA for what they wanted to do. And if you think about what they were doing with that Miami station, you've got the cream of the crop, the hardcore covert operators. So, when you need to do things on that level, you need a Joannides, you need a Theodore Shackley, you need a David Atlee Phillips, you need a Helms, you had them all. Well, let's see if I can squeeze these things in. Just so we know what we're dealing with here. So, take a look at these three figures. You've got, obviously, Lee Harvey Oswald over here. This is Antonio Betiana, who we hired in the CIA to do anti-Castro raids and things like that. And through Alpha 66 was the name of his group. And then David Atlee Phillips. David Atlee Phillips was in charge of all covert activities in the Western Hemisphere. He was the top guy during the Kennedy era. Now, Betiana eventually felt betrayed by this character whose name was Maurice Bishop, who was a CIA guy who was giving him funding for Alpha 66. What he found out later was the person that he thought was Maurice Bishop was David Atlee Phillips. So there was a lot of kind of hype around this in the committee era of the late 70s. And he went on the record and said, yeah, it was Maurice Bishop. And here's the thing. When I was working with Maurice Bishop, he introduced me to Oswald. He was with Oswald in Texas. Interesting thing to note that Phillips was from Texas. He was originally an actor. He was a very unusual guy in the middle of all this. There's something particularly controversial I'm going to get into at the end here.
Why wait? Let's go now.
Here's what Betiana had to say. Dear Marie Fonzi, who's the wife of Gaetan Fonzi, who's a big JFK investigator. This is from the 50th anniversary, so 2013. You may publish the following statement from me. Maurice Bishop, my CIA contact agent, was David Atlee Phillips. Phillips, or Bishop, was the man I saw with Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas in September of 63. So there's the leader of Alpha 66 identifying Phillips as, who's the top CIA guy, taking Oswald around in September of 63 and getting him oriented to his assignment. So Betiana, by the way, was shot in the head after giving his testimony in the 70s, stayed away from the whole scene. But he resurfaced in the 50th anniversary and said, you know, just so you know, like I'm still here and here's my testimony. That's very significant because what you're seeing with the media is like, oh, wow, Oswald had a CIA connection? No way. And there, in 2013, like I said earlier with the 1976 flap, um, you have this thing where they say Betiana said Oswald was with Maurice Bishop. So the CIA has been implicated. It's been kind of proven through. There's enough testimony on the ground to show that relationship. Now we have the CIA giving us their own document that they interfered and associated and interacted with Oswald before the assassination. That was never on the record before. All the researchers knew it, of course. But the real thing that we need in relation to all this is the Central Intelligence Agency moved on executive action, did the assassination, and used Oswald as the puppet. That's why they were interacting with him to create a patsy legend, which is what Joannides did as the top psychological warfare officer. And warfare, I want to underscore, it's warfare for them. So when you're doing something, it's not like just a psyop for influence or data mining. They're engaged in war. So if they need to engage in a war of opinion, they need to engage in a war of attitude, a war of supposition. It's a war to get your mind to think a certain way about a certain thing. And for years and years and years, they tried this through the public. 60 years holding the secret in the bag over the American people's head. And over again, the polls would come back 70%, sometimes higher, that would say, no, public doesn't believe Oswald acted alone. The only people who promoted it were, the completely corrupt media channels like CNN and ABC and all that stuff, and all those terrible specials and all those reconstructions and all that junk. So,
Because the CIA has infiltrated their news agencies. We know this.
Yes, exactly. They do. And they have such a presence that you can't get any truth in relation to, what's going on between Iran and Israel or something like that. Forget it. You're going to have to take a completely different approach to get the truth around those types of things. Because if you take the CIA word for it, they're just going to do whatever's in the interest of that machine. And that machine is morphing. Remember, one of the things that the CIA did not have in the era of the Kennedy administration, not only is the technology, but they didn't have Homeland Security or the emergency powers piece so well defined as that has been since September 11th, 2001. And now that you have Northcom and Homeland Security has 270,000 employees. Okay. I mean, that's a lot of employees. What are all those people? So, you've got all these arms for the Central Intelligence Agency now. You have the widespread surveillance, and there has to be a huge discussion about reining in the powers of those intelligence agencies. They almost, overthrew in the 2017, 2018 period, they almost overthrew the entire Trump government over the phony lie of Russian collusion and all that stuff. So, their power can be used against a Republican, Democrat, it doesn't matter. But that power base there, one of the questions that I have in relation to the Trump administration is, can people like Tulsi Gabbard and Radcliffe and others clean up this intelligence mess? I don't think so. I think what they can do is install some kind of transparency at the top, with efforts like this. But I think the sprawling nature of the whole thing requires an entire rebuilding and getting to the heart of the Kennedy assassination, which after all is the murder of the chief executive by his own security apparatus, is crucial. And that's why the Kennedy assassination sits out there in history as this anomaly, because it's very clear for anyone who looks deep into it that the government covered up the assassination. And they put all these phony things out there, and that the media cooperated, and there was this whole kind of global silence about President Kennedy's murder. The hints came out, the cracks showed in the program of shutting it down, covering it up in the 1970s, again in the 1990s with the Oliver Stone movie. But these are eras moving forward. I mean, this is like grandparents and parents, I mean, we're going through generations with this thing. What exactly was going on there? And I'm telling you, the heart of it is executive action, but the why of it is the UFO file and the exotic technology aspect. That's the crucial piece in the middle of all this. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Whew, deep tonight. Dark Journalist, JFK Joannides and the UFO file. One quick thing, and then we're off to your questions, Miss
Okay.
Olivia. Okay, fantastic. And
Mhm.
again, we just did a show on when did I put out the Bosley show? Thursday, just before July 4th. And that is a very interesting show with a lot of background on NIMSA, this shadowy airship group operating very early, long before we hear about UFO reports, 1947. You don't want to miss that one. Great interview. What else you got?
Leo Persha says the CIA are professionals in the art of deception. How can anything they say be trusted?
Well, that's a good point, too. Trust me, the things that they're holding back are massive. And it's kind of funny because you have some of these researchers out there, we've been telling them forever that the Central Intelligence Agency was involved in it. And they were always like, no, we're not conspiracy theorists. We just want this paperwork about such and such to get the historical record right or whatever. And now they're like, oh, wow, well, like the CIA was involved in covering this up or whatever. And it's like, yeah, welcome to the party. Here's the next piece. They're involved in the actual assassination too. You want to get on board with that? Because just having a kind of historical correction that, oh, hey, they were trying to just hide their relationship with Oswald or, hide mafia influence assassination. No, they don't care anything. They wouldn't have tried to hide that. They probably would have enjoyed having the mafia hung out to dry for the assassination. The mafia could never do the assassination of President Kennedy because there's too much state control in the assassination. They can hire the mafia to eliminate witnesses, things like that. They'd be very good at that. But, obfuscating, changing autopsies and things like that, you need such a seal of approval. And also, the assassination of a president is executive action. It's very different than assassinating a senator, like the assassinated Senator Robert Kennedy when he was becoming president. Because once you assassinate, it's much easier to assassinate somebody on that level than it is. You need a whole apparatus to assassinate the president. And you have to have the person who's going to replace him be lined up and everything else. And in this case, they had Johnson, who was very willing to go along with it all because, after all, he was headed straight to prison.
Mhm.
We know that through the Bobby Baker scandal and others, Billy Celeste, and his own criminal background in Texas. So that's where he was headed. As soon as they killed Kennedy, he was home free. He was like, great, I'm president, and I don't have to go to jail. They were actually that day getting testimony about bribes that LBJ had received in the Senate Intelligence Committees. I mean, that's what was actually happening November 22nd. And it's interesting to note that Nixon, who was in Texas, he was in Dallas actually for Pepsi Cola that same day. There are a lot of presidents, by the way, former, future, current presidents in there during the assassination day. Nixon was there, Ford was there, Bush was there. It's incredible how many presidents were actually in Dallas during the whole thing. But what he said was that LBJ was going to be dropped from the ticket. He said that at a press conference the morning of the assassination. So it
Who
was
said that?
LBJ. Nixon said it about LBJ.
Oh.
Yeah. So, it was out there. He knew. He was, a political gossip himself. He's like, well, I'm very sure that they're going to choose somebody else. And in fact, Evelyn Lincoln, who's Kennedy's secretary, had said, oh, yeah, he pulled me aside and said, oh, no, we're not going to have LBJ on the ticket. We're going to have Terry Sanford of North Carolina. So look into his background and all this stuff. That's who they were going to go with. And for sure, LBJ's good friend, J. Edgar Hoover, was like, you're going to be dumped from that ticket. We better make some moves. Speaking of moves, I want to put this on the record because it gets missed a lot, but this has to do with Oswald. So much of the Joannides thing has to do with Oswald in New Orleans. New Orleans is crucial because when Oswald is in New Orleans, and he grew up there, remember that and all that. He will work when he comes back from Russia for Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister's ultra right wing, anti-communist, anti-Castro, all these different. And he runs this whole private eye network and everything else, but he's the former chief of the FBI for the Chicago office. But before that, he was the field agent who created the X-Files and did all these cases in places like Montana, Idaho, Oregon, the Pacific Northwest. And he is shown in all of these newspaper articles responding to those UFO cases, walking around where the saucer landed to get trace elements, all that stuff. And then he creates the X nomenclature. This is the X steganography here for the advanced technology that he's tracking. That's the UFO file. He's Oswald's boss. We have to get that clear because very often you'll hear about Bannister and they'll be like, oh, yeah, this guy was doing all this anti-communist stuff. Yes, that is important because Oswald, after all, is portrayed as a communist, as a leftist, and all this other weird stuff. And I'm going to show you how deep those levels of stories around Oswald go. Now, as soon as the assassination happens, a family comes forward out of North Dakota and they say, look, Lee Oswald, he grew up, he was my best friend in this little town in North Dakota that was like an oil town. And he lived in one of these trailers where they had all these different workers live while the father would go off and work drilling oil and things like that. The family would stay behind in the trailer. And there's this one guy who was like, oh yeah, he had this beautiful mother. And also he describes this totally different person. And, Oswald is around 14 or 15 during this period. There's no record of Oswald in North Dakota at all. Okay. This guy said he lived there for 2 years. Now, it's very interesting. The mother's like, absolutely, I'll testify to this. And she says, remember the incident in the library? And they start to talk to the FBI about this. This is on the record. And they try to give the information to the Warren Commission. They're like, when he was, 15, he went into this library and he was looking for a copy of Karl Marx's manifesto and he couldn't find it. And he flipped out. He had this like completely over the top saying, you're lying to the public. You're not including this. This should be here. This is so important. Why are you trying to, suppress Karl Marx and all this stuff? And the police show up at the library and drag him out. That they say, hey, that's on record. Well, look, they were building all these different Oswald backgrounds for when they were going to utilize it. Because here they would have a story of like, oh, Oswald in North Dakota, he was looking into Marxist stuff. He went into the library. He was trying to study communism. They dragged him out. That's how much of a zealot he was. So they had all these weird other Oswald backdrop stories, these backstops that they could bring out at any time. You have to understand how deep the operation goes. And also remember this when you talk about Lee Harvey Oswald, that he, because his mother couldn't afford him when she was living in New York, put him in an orphanage for a number. So the number of things and what they could have done with Oswald as a kind of a ward of the state, and considering how they moved him around through these different things like, hey, we're going to set you up at Atsugi in Japan. You're going to have the top security clearance. You're the top guy. And, that's our Japanese Area 51. I mean, after all, why shouldn't Oswald get the top billing? Isn't he the Marine who walks around and says he's a communist? Why on earth would you give that guy a top security clearance? Well, next up, he says, I'm out of here. I'm leaving this country. I'm a defector. I'm going to go to Russia and I'm going to give them all my radar secrets. And then he's living in Russia. They stick him in this very fancy radio factory in Minsk where all of the top physicists of the world come to visit. And he gets to meet them all these incredible physicists. And he gets 3,000 rubles a month. And he gets this incredible apartment and all these, Russian women and all this. I mean, guy is being moved for this very, very important role that he's going to play on November 22nd, 63. And of course, that is the name he is using, Alec J. Heidel. And that's the card that they find on him. One quick thing also, since when we talk about Joannides, the whole thing about Mexico City and that whole thing comes up. I've already shown how the visa situation with Mexico City, of the person who gets the visa to Mexico City, the first one's Oswald, the next one was rubbed out by the CIA, and then the FBI later finds out, oh, that was actually a CIA agent who went right after Oswald. That's not Oswald that goes. There's no identification of Oswald in Mexico City. And it's very interesting because they took pictures, the Central Intelligence Agency took pictures of the guy entering and identifying himself. And we know that those are the pictures. Whoever that is, it's not Lee Harvey Oswald. What's even stranger is if you go into the Sylvia Duran story about Oswald in New Mexico, she said not only was that a totally different Oswald, she had an affair with the guy. And Sylvia Duran was the person who was like the secretary at the Cuban consulate. And as soon as the assassination happens, the Mexican authorities bring her in, interrogate her. They make her life hell. And she comes out later and talks all about it. This is the guy that came in and had a relationship with her. This guy is Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico. You understand the depth of the intelligence manipulation? It seems like it's also more than one group that's operating here, building the Oswald legend. Who the hell is this guy?
I didn't know that story about Sylvia
Duran. Oh, yeah. She is very interesting. And the early stages of the Kennedy assassination, she's a key figure. And they're interrogating her. Oh, that's a close-up of our Lee Harvey Oswald hanging out at the Soviet embassy, waiting to get in. But, the shame of it is when he gets to the Cuban embassy, you know what happens? Yeah. Stop working,
Yeah,
darn it.
they love
Shucks.
that.
It's like when Epstein goes to kill himself, oops, the film stops working. What do you know about that? But don't worry about it because Kash Patel and Dan Bongino say, no, he killed himself. That's a problem. That's a problem there at the new FBI. I wanted to show this real quickly, which is in relation to the D-Class committee, and that's Luna and Burchett. So in the early stage of setting up that committee, the next round of it was going to be all these UFO things. And that's Mellon there with Elizondo and Dan Burleson and all the rest of it. And it's interesting to me because Elizondo, as I mentioned, got into controversy by showing false material there, which I still find suspicious. But the kind of influence, they had infiltrated this whole thing, the whole D-Class committee on the UFO side. The Luna hearings in relation to the JFK assassination have been pretty tame, but Luna was able, through John Ratcliffe, to get the Joannides file, the excerpts of the file, which is the stuff that's going through the mainstream media now, which is significant. So that committee can do something. If they can take the bull by the horns and really aim it for the aerospace role in the assassination, using the information we've put on the record. And remember, we've been putting this stuff on the record way ahead of it coming out to the public. So they can use this. And that's why I'm going to send this letter to that congressional committee to see if they do something with it. That's if they want to really actually make a difference. Or, it could be just a vanity committee. So it's going to be one or the other. That's for sure. And with that, Ms. Olivia, I'm going to turn to your questions, although I have a couple of other things that I'll float in as we are on our way out.
Okay, I'm going to start here. Isoparametric says, is DJ the reason for the release of these files?
Look, I'd say that the ripple in the ideas room of us having this conversation, which is really kind of a forbidden conversation about these things, you get a lot of, pop click stuff about different topics and things like that. But to be able to deliver the information, and I know from my own interactions that people in those committees watch this, but if you can deliver it, and if they say, oh, it's something that we can actually, do something, it makes that huge difference. In my opinion, raising the profile of something like the Joannides file instantly puts the pressure on them. And, there are other researchers about it and people who gave testimony and all the rest. And it's interesting. I was going to read one. This is interesting. This comes out of the committee hearing. Let's see here. This is Judge Tunheim, okay? And he was the judge who oversaw the Assassination Record Review Board. And he wrote in the Boston Herald, there's a body of documents that the CIA is still protecting, which should be released, relying on inaccurate representations made by the CIA in the mid-1990s. The review board decided that records related to a deceased CIA agent named George Joannides were not relevant to the Kennedy assassination. You see how when you say, I want you to give us all the records pertaining to the JFK assassination, all they have to do is say, that's not relevant. So if you say, I want your UFO file related to this period, 61 to 63, and the blue UFO program, all the CIA has to say is, well, it's not related to the Kennedy assassination. It's not relevant. We're not giving it to you. That's how it works. But anyway, he goes on. And remember, this is before the records were released. This is a couple years before. Were not relevant to the Kennedy assassination. Subsequent work by researchers using other records that were released by the board demonstrate that these records should be made public. In 2022, the Mary Farrell Foundation filed a lawsuit in an attempt to secure the release of the Joannides files. So you can see how the Joannides thing has been there in the background. In 2025, the government documents reveal that Joannides' organization had contact with Oswald before the JFK assassination. It's crucial. It's historic. Not enough, but it is important. And if that committee can take up the call to smash the aerospace myth piece and get to the heart of the exotic technology and the role of that in the assassination, then you're going places. That's the key. Yes.
Vardian, any idea if when more Joannides files are going to be released?
I don't know that they are. What I've seen is, again, they've been very selective. Like, you want these records. You want the things that they have put on the record. Now, it's not like you're going to get that confession in the CIA records. But the reason that they've held them is they didn't want people to be able to connect these dots. They've been worried. And it's much easier to just obfuscate, put up that wall of secrecy, etc. At this point, it's interesting because Professor Scott has a quote about it, which is that it has malformed the entire American experience, the holding back and the blocking out of the JFK assassinations. And I would go even further, because Professor Scott will talk about various deep events in history, and he'll talk about Kennedy assassination and Watergate, Iran-Contra, 2001, September 11th, the financial coup d'etat, 2008, COVID. These are all deep events where a covert group comes in and moves into the public overt society, makes an adjustment, has some deep event happen, and then withdraws. And we're left collecting the rubble of what's going on. And they've committed, some kind of a false flag event or whatever it happens to be. And then they get a policy change as a result of it. That's the way that pattern works. But what I see is that there are other deep events related to this. Roswell, for example, I would contend is a deep event as well. So I would build on that fantastic research of someone like Scott on the deep state side, who doesn't touch the UFO file. He's, very kind of dealing with that political issue. But I think if you include the UFO file when you're dealing with the deep state activity, then you get the full. Yes.
Okay.
That's why we did Roswell Reignited, by the way, which is showing that overlap. It even shows overlap in personnel between the Kennedy assassination and the people who run the Foster Roswell Ranch. And that's the cop, Deputy Boone, who goes into the Texas School Book Depository and holds up that rifle. I I'll just do this real quick because the Roswell Reignited series that we're doing is explosive. And, the things that we're putting together around it have never been heard before. But Boone, who was the first person who went into that Texas School Book Depository and found the Oswald rifle, and by the way, the rifle he identified was a Mauser, which is not Oswald's rifle. He would end up running all of the Foster business. He became the CEO of the Foster's business, and the Fosters were the ones who owned the Foster Ranch in Roswell, and they sold it to the government, who said, "We need that ranch, whatever it is, you can't hold back, and we'll give you mineral rights." And they're like, "Well, we want to keep the ranch." No. How about a gold mine? How does that sound? We'll take it. They took it. But the very interesting arc in history that the same guy who goes in and finds the Oswald rifle runs all of the Foster business for the Foster Ranch people who owned the Roswell Ranch. I mean, really, what are we talking about here? What did you want to say? I'm sorry.
RCA wants to know, if Boone saw Oswald on that plane to Roswell, did Ruby shoot a double or the real guy?
Well, it's interesting. That's somebody else. And that's Robert Vinson. That's Sergeant Robert Vinson. And what happens with him is he's a NORAD officer. And he has an interesting experience on November 22nd, 1963. He gets on this plane and he's heading back to Colorado from D.C. He gets on this C-54 and it doesn't have any of the things he's used to, like the flag emblem and all that stuff, but they tell him to get on it. And he sees a character get on. Midway on the flight to Colorado, they say, "President Kennedy has been assassinated. We're diverting to Dallas." And they pull the plane around and they land by Trinity River. And he said it looks like a construction site. And these guys get on and they're kind of in highway construction overalls. And he said the first one looked exactly like Lee Harvey Oswald. The second one was a very tall Cuban guy. And then they don't say anything to him. They sit up in the front with the pilot. And then they say, "We're taking off now." And then it goes on for a little while. He assumes, hey, they're taking me back to headquarters in Colorado. And it lands. The pilot, the Oswald double, and the Cuban run off the plane. They don't say anything to Robert Vinson, Sergeant. And it's really strange because what happens is he gets off and he sees like an MP in an office with a light. He goes in and he says, "Where am I?" And the MP says, "You're in Roswell Air Force Base. Well, what can we do for you?" And he says, "I'm supposed to be back in Colorado." He's like, "Nobody's flying anywhere. Everything's locked down because of the assassination." But they flew the Oswald double from Trinity River to Roswell, showing that Roswell has some different kind of almost like COG piece in all of this, that the COG network that's active during the Kennedy assassination is connected with Roswell. So I think Vinson's testimony was ignored. It was ignored by the Roswell people. It was ignored by the JFK researchers. It was too hot to handle. And so that's significant. Boone, Deputy Boone, who found the rifle on the 6th floor and said, "This is Oswald's rifle," that's a totally new discovery. I've put that on the record. It's not anywhere. It's, that's totally new stuff. So what I'm doing with the Vinson story is I'm giving context around that. If you combine the two, you've got an explosive story. But just the fact that Boone is, the cop that finds the the rifle is running the Foster business for the Roswell people. I mean, this is, you're in strange territory there. That's what Marcel knew the minute he picked the stuff up. He said, "Oh my God, it's a spaceship covered in hieroglyphics. So what am I going to do here?" Yeah, that was a great one, by the way. Zinger of a question.
Along those lines, Lancelot Link wants to know, DJ, did David Atlee Phillips also run the doubles?
Oh, I'm sure. I think that they had expertise, though, which is why I think Joannides is deeply involved in the doubles, because that's psychological warfare and building a legend. This is what they did with Oswald. That's why even when he's in Russia, there are people over here that are buying arms and stuff in his name. And here's a very interesting and peculiar fact about Oswald, which is that in 1960, 3 years before the assassination, J. Edgar Hoover, the top man at the FBI, the director for many, many decades, writes a memo that somebody is using Oswald's name and identity while he's in Russia. So he's aware of Oswald in 19. What does that tell you about the actual assassination? The typical story is, oh, disgruntled Oswald. He beat his wife. He was unhappy. He was making $1.25 an hour. What a loser. He figures, I have to do something to change my life. And then he hears, hey, the president's going to go right by that place you just got a job at. I mean, this story was cooked up and it had a hold. And everybody, I think, who looked even a little into it must have felt uneasy. But there's always been a very loud chorus. And as we know, the story never held. The mind job, the psyop of the JFK assassination has not really held. People have always known, yeah, probably the CIA killed him. They've always had it in there. They've always sort of known that this is not as it appeared to be. And so for all of their tips and tricks and Joannides' magic of psychological warfare and all the rest, let me tell you, they failed. They failed in that respect. So they were able to pull off the assassination and the cover-up ever after. It's true. And they were able to change those policies. So in that sense, the deep state was successful with it, but they never convinced the American public. Check this out. Atlee Phillips, by the way, who, of course, gets his own Career Intelligence Medal from Allen Dulles, he probably for pulling off the Kennedy assassination, he leaves behind a manuscript, which is an unpublished novel at the end of his life. So when he dies of cancer, there's this thing hanging around. By the way, there's a famous scene of his brother when he's dying, yelling at him in the hospital and saying, "Were you in Dallas on that day? I need to know. Tell me." And that Phillips looks up at him and says, "Yeah, I was." So Phillips' deathbed confession there to his brother is also on the record. Here's what Atlee Phillips had to say in that unpublished manuscript. Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
I was one of the 2 case officers who handled Lee Harvey Oswald. After working to establish his Marxist bona fides, we gave him the mission of killing Fidel Castro in Cuba. I helped him when he came to Mexico City to obtain a visa, and when he returned to Dallas to wait for it. I saw him twice there. We rehearsed the plan many times. In Havana, Oswald was to assassinate Castro with a sniper's rifle from the upper floor window of a building on the route where Castro often drove in an open car. I don't know why he killed Kennedy, but I do know he used precisely the plan we had devised against Castro. Thus, the CIA did not anticipate the president's assassination, but it was responsible for it. Very interesting sleight of hand there at the end of his life, putting out some of the truth of the JFK assassination. In fact, yes.
Okay, Housatonic Live 2. Do you factor in the death of Senator Estes Kefauver? Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Kefauver Committee.
Who only several weeks before JFK was effectively likely assassinated right on the congressional floor, the major Kefauver FDA 1962 amendments passed the year prior. Mrs. Kefauver, last political JFK appointment.
Oh, yes. Well, there's all kinds of things with Kefauver because those committees that were investigating racketeering and government corruption, but also this kind of mafia takeover thing. I think Joseph Farrell's made the point in his book in McCarthy. By the way, that is a picture of Vincent, who saw the Oswald double and had to get on a plane to Roswell. He was a sergeant for NORAD, and he was sergeant in the Air Force. So it is very interesting about Kefauver, and there's no question that Kennedy's presence, John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy's presence on these different committees, questioning Hoffa and all this kind of thing, And early on, Robert Kennedy being on McCarthy's committee, which was investigating anti-communism and all the rest of it, shows the very interesting allegiances behind the scenes, President Kennedy, and there was a fierce anti-communist streak in him and his family. Of course, famously, Joe Kennedy, who was ambassador to the UK, got thrown out of that job after maneuvering himself to the top of this like posh government job with all of his Wall Street shenanigans and all the different things that he did, you know. But he said, he said basically it's overwhelming what the Germans are doing, and we're going to have to make some kind of deal with fascism here. I think that people in England should be ready for that. And that was seen as appeasement and seen as like, you're handing the UK over to the Nazis. And he was relieved of duty very shortly thereafter and became an embarrassment for what Kennedy was trying to do, get into office and things like that. They had to keep him in the back during the campaign, but he was moving the levers that he knew so well. And Joseph Kennedy was an incredible power player. But I think what's interesting about your question is that anti-communist thing that comes up over and over again. And in all those committees going on in the 1950s, something strange was happening. They were trying to get to the root of like, what, there's a communist aspect, there's a fascist aspect, there's a mafia aspect. They were trying to root out something that had taken control, and they didn't know where to land on it. One of the things that they didn't get their hands on was this X-Protect group that I've identified. And X-Protect is the same group, in my opinion, that takes out President Kennedy over the UFO file. And it is an aerospace crime. It's related directly to this aerospace aspect and Kennedy's commitment to having that space program be open, cooperative with the public, and also cooperative, doing joint moon missions and things like that, and calling off the space race and all this kind of stuff. So if he's working with the Russians on that, it comes up, of course, in the famous memo that Kennedy sends at the end of his life, the CIA director saying, I want you to give me all the high threat cases so I can share those with our Russian counterparts so that we don't have a nuclear incident, mistaken identity, that kind of thing. So make sure you get those all to me, within the next 90 days. And that is probably, if you look at it, the final shred on the record that we can see that's just, here's President Kennedy, and he is the big threat to that nest of people who are vested in a totally different outlook. And a lot of that comes in through the paperclip aspect on the NASA side. So that's what you need to look into if you are part of this committee. You would have to go deep into what were the forces that were active during, for that task force. What were the forces that were active in 1963 and that had the ability to remove the president, and the reason? And if you understand the advanced technology in the UFO file piece, then you get to the heart of it. Then you can start to open up things like Joannides and Inman, et cetera. If they just put Inman under oath and say, one, what's your knowledge of the UFO file? And two, why was Joannides given the Career Intelligence Medal after deflecting for the hearings all of the JFK CIA connection? Did that relate directly to your role working in the UFO file? Is that why you're there handing him the award? These are the things that can be done. And by the way, there's a lot more. Yes.
Rebecca Ramaley. They need to subpoena Michelle Combs and Barry Harrelson. They are both around, and they were specific CIA people who wrote to the Assassinations Board and lied about Joannides being
That's
Howard
true.
Gebler.
That's true. Well, what came up was they were confronted, a number of these officials were confronted with this name, Howard Gebler. And what they said is, no, Howard it's a routing name. So if there were payments made to this group, Howard is just like saying that's how the checking goes for so they had a good lie set up. But in doing that, they lied. There was a number of CIA lies when they're being pressed legally to give up the Joannides records long before this, because there have been fights over those records for over the past 20 years or so. And, but these are things that have gone on in the background. One of the good things I think we've been able to do is bring out the aspect of why the Joannides records are important. And the fact that he was a CIA officer who was hiring a group to portray Oswald in a certain way so that they could set him up as the patsy is significant in any kind of legal or historic outlook on the JFK case. But what we're saying is if you go even deeper and you look into things like his relationship, because when you set up Oswald, you're setting up somebody who's working for somebody who set up the UFO file, you know? So Oswald, it's a very interesting story. If you go into the Garrison case, he says, well, when I went to Riley Coffee Company, I went to, the first thing I was going to do was get all of his coworkers from that summer, you know, and question them about Oswald and everything else. When I went there, I found out all of them had gone to work for either NASA or another aerospace military defense contractor. And then I found out that Oswald himself was walking around when he's leaving that job and saying, yeah, I'm going to work for NASA. Isn't that great? So NASA was, and he said, that's my pot of gold, or like all this really strange language. So we're in deep on aerospace. The minute you get into the JFK assassination, you are surrounded by aerospace. And that includes Lloyd Berkner, who we brought forward in the documentary, because Berkner, not only is he working with Kennedy on the moon missions and all that stuff, but he is the guy who headed up the Robertson UFO panel. And I want to say this, and we'll probably leave off this episode on this, which is that's Lloyd Berkner. And Berkner is who Kennedy was going to meet at the Texas Dallas Trade Mart. And he had the Research Science Center there, which eventually became the University of Texas, Dallas. And it is noted in his own records that the speech he was going to make with President Kennedy was going to have international implications. That's what he said. He dies shortly after very unusual circumstances as well. And so that's all in my documentary, JFK, the final speech, the UFO file. Now, this is an interesting little sidebar on that, which is just before all of that stuff with, getting Kennedy into the moon program and the stuff that Berkner was doing. Not only did he set up the International Geophysical Year, and not only, if you go further back into his history, you're going to find him in 1928 going to Antarctica with Admiral Byrd at the age of 22 as a radio specialist. This is somebody who's on the deep, deep edge. Antarctica, the UFO file, International Geophysical Year, and he's the person that Kennedy is going to meet, this physicist at the Trade Mart when he gets assassinated. Obviously, this is a major play here. And the whole, kind of labyrinth maze around that speech that Kennedy was to give becomes very, very important. And we track that in there. But this is something that I think is significant. The year before Kennedy gets into office, there's this headline in the New York Times: engineer killed, Lloyd Berkner kin hurt, New Yorker in crash of his car and that of scientist's wife and daughter, 18. Now, this crash happened, and the engineer was killed, and the engineer was working on deep black projects as well. And I think this was some message to somebody about Berkner. This is like the message directly to Berkner, like, we bumped off this guy and he crashed headlong into your wife and daughter. A New York structural engineer was killed, and the wife and daughter of Dr. Lloyd Berkner, a New York scientist, were seriously injured here yesterday in a head-on collision. I think that was a message to Berkner to pull it on the UFO file. And I found the whole thing just too strange. If you go into it a little bit, it just seems that there was more of an edge to it than a happenstance, especially when you get into the driver. Now, this is interesting. I found this for people who said, well, Lloyd Berkner, he did head up the Robertson panel. He did all this UFO stuff in 52, but then he moved on when he did IGY. He wasn't interested in UFOs anymore. So this is to Lloyd Berkner from the CIA, December 20th, 1957. And he's the president of Associated Universities Incorporated in New York at the time. And it says, with reference to our prior conversations on unidentified flying objects, here is enclosed for your information a copy of a letter to the Air Force together with the declassified version of the panel report. You may find this interesting. Berkner's getting deep info from the CIA about the UFO file here many, many years after. So I hope that settles some things. We'll take our final two questions. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show deep tonight here on the Joannides file release, which is a great triumph. On one hand, even getting the excerpts, it proves this aspect of the Central Intelligence Agency that researchers have contended for decades, that the CIA was, involved with Oswald pre-assassination. The next part, of course, to bring forward is the CIA's involvement and why. And that's what that committee can do. We'll take two more of your questions before we go any further. What do you got?
I'm going to read a comment. Deep 404 says, as for myself, I grow weary of spooks pretending folks aren't wise to their exploits, like some toddler denying they consumed the blueberry pie with a blue face. These people are emotional children.
Oh, wow.
I read that and I immediately thought about the 12 steps, and that, we know that everybody they're all alcoholics. These people are unhappy people and they're sick people. And one of the
Oh, yeah.
steps is about accountability and not lying and all this. And this is actually what Americans, certainly from our leaders, but also from citizens, is to, if everybody got on board with sort of the 12 steps, we would be in a much better place.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of these people get into positions of power so vacant. Yeah, think about like Hillary Clinton. I mean, I know she's already gotten a lot of public hate and things, but I mean, this is somebody who just seems to, have taken her empathy cord and cut it out. Okay, Professor Scott giving us the broad stroke on this, and then we'll take your last question. More specifically, 3 different deceptive stratagems need to be distinguished in relation to the JFK assassination. A sophisticated intelligence operation or complex of operations. 1. 2, the conspiracy to kill the president and the ensuing cover-up. That's 3, cover-up. All 3 are intertwined and each can tell us something about the others. We should expect that government records will tell us more about the first and the third than about the second. But I've been saying for 30 years that the oblique path to the truth about the murder is the best hope which the documents give us. Even on the limited topic of Oswald, Mexico, and Cuba, there's far more to be written than I have been able to achieve in these limited essays. 2 areas in particular are underrepresented here. Disagreements between Kennedy and the CIA over specific strategy and Cuban personnel to replace Fidel Castro, and Oswald's intriguing relations with the Cuban exile groups, such as the DRE, discussed to some extent through Deep Politics in the Death of JFK, my book. Let me say that again. Discussed to some extent in my book, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. In both of these areas, I'm still awaiting publication of work by other researchers. And then this. It's certain that the effect of the falsified Oswald documentation, consciously or accidentally, was to incriminate him falsely as an apparent KGB assassin. This is what I think Joannides' work was all about. One day after the assassination, the CIA counterintelligence chief speculated on the sinister implication of Oswald's alleged contact with Kostikov in the Russian. Kostikov will explain who he is. And it continued to do so for years after, that is, speculate on the nature of this. For Kostikov was not just a known KGB agent, he was suspected by counterintelligence officials in the FBI and the CIA of working with KGB's Department 13, which, according to a contemporary CIA memo, was, quote, responsible for sabotage and assassination. This falsified picture of Oswald as a potential KGB assassin, though never used by the Warren Commission against him, almost certainly contributed to the Warren Commission's determination to close the case as the work of a lone assassin. The alleged Oswald Kostikov Department 13 connection must have seemed particularly ominous after the commission was formed by Richard. Now, what he's saying there is the way that they got them to the lone nut thing was by feeding them the lie that the stooge duplicate double who went into Mexico City and made noises at the Cuban embassy and met with officials at the Soviet embassy. It was a totally different person. And it's interesting because, of course, they would have had photo and, audio of this. And it's interesting because there's a Warren Commission lawyer who says, "Well, I remember them playing this tape of Oswald at the embassy, and it was some guy like speaking bad broken Russian. It didn't sound like Oswald, but I remember that they had a tape of it." They've always denied the tape, and they gave us, of course, the phony pictures of this other guy. So, but what they were able to do with that suggestion that he went to those embassies and, was trying to get into Cuba and all the rest was that, oh, if it gets out that he was, sent by the Russians and the Cubans to kill Kennedy, all these Americans will die. So you need to dummy up and say he was the lone assassin and have everyone go along with it. And that'll really keep the status quo in place. And that's why you get people like Earl Warren and others who didn't want to be involved in the commission. That's how they get on there. And the other piece of that, of course, is that Allen Dulles, the CIA director that Kennedy unceremoniously deposed after the Bay of Pigs because he tried to trick Kennedy into invading Cuba. He's the one who heads up the committee, in fact, and runs all of the intelligence angles. So he knows, here's how I can keep Joannides out of this. Here's how I can keep Helms, Theodore Shackley, and all these people out of it and say, oh no, Ruby didn't have mob connections. Oswald didn't have CIA connections. And this whole thing was just a raving lunatic who needed to feel important. And the media forever after would spin this story through special after special, ABC TV, PBS, newspapers, and all the rest of it. So it was a wall of noise, of deception. And in some sense, today we've collapsed part of that wall of noise. And it's very important, I think, with the work that we do around this case, that it's taken in that spirit, which is the kind of potent research you can apply to the thing, can cause a crack in those walls of secrecy. And it starts with conversations like what we have here in the ideas room. It's that ripple, and that ripple grows as it rumbles out. And those are the conversations that I think the censorship is all about. Those are the types of conversations that they want to stop. Miss Olivia, your last question of the evening.
It's got to be this one. Rat Boy Genius, is it possible to get JFK disclosure without UFO disclosure?
No, I mean, what you can do, they can set up the backstop version of disclosure on it. Oh, the mafia got him, or some Cubans got him, and they've had that story ready since the 1960s. It's the phase 3 story, right? Phase 1 is Soviets and the Cubans did it. And then, oh no, can't say that, there'll be World War III. Just say Oswald did it. He was the lone gunman. But in the background there, they were like, well, if we really get pressed on it, there's this mafia story, the mafia were planning on it, But of course, the problem always has been the mafia could never pull off an assassination like that, and the cover up ever after. So those things never made sense. The hidden aspect, and it's very hard to bring out because, of course, the UFO thing is very hard even to talk about in the context on the national security side. Maybe not as much now as it had been. But Kennedy's relationship to that, my interview with Caddy, Harold Malmgren, going on the record before he died, and I talked to Malmgren as well. But he gave those interviews that his daughter set up just before he died, saying that he thought Kennedy was killed over the UFO file. And, it's this steady understanding that this is what's really happening in the background, and that could happen on this level, that Kennedy was using, if in fact the national security secret, our top national security secret, was the UFO file. then, you know, Kennedy trying to share it with the Russians sets up these groups on the CIA side, on the X-Protect paperclip side to say he needs to be removed so that never happens. So they can keep that UFO secret. So it's in the heart of UFO secrecy, is in the heart of the JFK assassination. No question. Yeah, what do you got?
It's amazing. Caitlin Fallon
Oh,
says,
yeah.
I am currently in labor watching this. Nothing can make me miss DJ.
Well, congratulations.
Respect.
Congratulations. Yeah, I hope everything goes fantastic. And that's actually a good way to end the episode, as it were. Miss Olivia, your super chats.
Okay. All right. By the way, Caitlin, God bless you and your new baby. May you be safe and healthy, and may your labor be swift. Okay. Like to thank Sick of the BS, Erica Swenson Elliott, Eurythmia's Fun, Terry Doherty, Jay Parsons, Teresa T, and Harvardian, and hold on, I'm missing people, and Housatonic Live 2. And if I missed anybody else, I apologize. I'm having an issue with my fan funding page. Thank you so much.
Well, we really appreciate your support. And to all our subscribers and supporters, thank you. We couldn't do what we do without you. And it makes a great deal of difference to know you're backing us up. We will be back with you next week. And there's a lot more to come out of these revelations, but we wanted to make sure that we spent that time on you while the story had just come out, because we've been working on the Joannides file for so many years. We put a lot of this on the record for you long before the media was talking about it, and of course with the Blue program and other things that we've put out there. This piece about Roswell Reignited also is something that you're going to be hearing more about as we get into it. But the JFK assassination piece, and the fact that there is technically now, until the end of September, a committee set up there to investigate JFK, RFK, and UAP secrecy, right? There's a window, there's a dedicated window, which this announcement, this whole piece, should open up a much bigger discussion, which is, if the CIA was involved with Oswald, what was their role in the executive action of removing the 35th president of the United States? And then what was the role of aerospace in that, and why? That'll bring you right to the doorstep of the UFO file. No question. And that's what we've been bringing forward to you. And we'll continue to bring you that potent reporting around that, and the potent guests, the fantastic guests on the program as well, who will help us do that. And you guys in the ideas room, that's a whole other incredible resource for us. So it's an abundance of riches, as they say. And with that, Miss Olivia, that is JFK Joannides and the UFO file. I'll do a couple of shout outs here as we go out. The amazing show. Thank you, sir. Stephen Van Vossen. Scarlet Fire. Saying hello to Andy B. Andy B's out there somewhere, whoever that is. Andy, it's good to see us. Thomas Ball. If Fox CNN said it, the CIA planned it. Exactly. Happy Hermit. God bless us one and all. Thank you, Happy. Antisocial, Sunday Fun Day. Indeed. I can't recall the last time we did a Sunday show. This is something, let me tell you. I might, this is special. I might have to start rapping on this microphone. Let's see. Project Redfoot, congratulations. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think it is a big day for people research. Let's see. Douglas Roberts, interesting. DJ, love your work. Keep going, but I think we will never know the real truth. Well, certainly that's possible. I understand your point of view, but it's strange. There's that David and Goliath story there laid out, tapestry in the Bible, that will tell you it's laid out there because it's kind of like, it is that Death Star thing in Star Wars, good mythology, which is if you hit it at just the right angle. Awesome show, Stefan. Thank you, sir. And thank you, DJ Olivia and the Ideas Room, S23, Esther Taylor, Breathwork, Najat. It's great to see you out there, Najat. Have a great night, X-Fam, indeed. Wow. fantastic crew out there. I know Kate's out there. Great to see you. Be safe, Gigi.
Can I throw you a
Yeah.
question that I didn't get to ask? It's an easy one.
Yes.
Bethany G says, DJ, do you think Bobby Inman would be willing to come on the show for you to interview?
Well, this is an amazing thing. There's one of these guys, I can't think of his name right now, but he was, they did all kinds of stuff to get him when he was podcasting and stuff on this Intel team. I think it sent him laptops and stuff like that. And they flew him over here and got him to meet all these CIA people thinking he was going to promote Lou and all that. And they set him up with an interview with Inman, and Inman was not willing to talk about the UFO file at all and just wanted to say very kind of bland stuff. So that guy got very disillusioned, and he runs a channel right now. I can't think of the name of it, but he got the interview.
So it's been attempted.
Yes, exactly. Excalibur Show, Camelot Returns. Exactly. But yeah, what they could do for sure. I mean, Inman came to the Secret Space Program conference that we did.
Oh my
in Austin.
God.
Yeah.
Did
And
you recognize him?
no, actually, it was someone else who pointed him out, and yeah, he was there.
Oh man,
So,
that's
yeah.
creepy.
He's let me tell you, Inman knows the score, and he's been doing a lot. I actually take an extra second to show you this, but I found his most recent job here. Well, I'll throw it up on Twitter, on Twitter X. It's very interesting, but he, this kind of LBJ think tank, I think, put it up there. But look, he's very sharp. This guy knows the deal, and he actually expressed some interest in revealing some things. So, maybe you're doing him a favor asking him to come before this congressional committee. It doesn't even need to be a hostile thing. But I think he should, and I think he should answer questions in relation to Joannides. And
karmically speaking, it would be in everybody's best interest to just disclose what they know at this.
He knows a great deal about the UFO file and said that we know exactly who is operating these craft. So he was a part of that late 80s, early 90s wave of disclosure. But something curtailed that one and curtailed him off that stage. And of course, that thing with Clinton getting rid of him as CIA director nominee, withdrawing his nomination, in fact. I never thought we would ever know. Wow. David Murphy, absolutely. And congratulations, right? It's when I was telling Olivia we were going to start with the Celebrate song, she said, how about We Are the Champions? So that's pretty good. So everyone, fantastic group out there tonight. Unbelievable. Of course, Free Wheezy and Antisocial, Ilcid Barrett, DA, CC, Nick Malone, Project Redford. What else we got out there? I know Walter was out there earlier. Of course, we just did an episode with him that was quite exceptional. I highly recommend it. Jessica Rodriguez. There once was a Camelot, and there can be again. Exactly. You took the words out of my mouth. So it says end broadcast, everyone, but
never really ends.
Never really ends. And of course, some good preliminary reading before we get to the next stage of Joannides' disclosure, American Deep State, by legendary Professor Peter Dale Scott, who's still out there rocking incredible work. And as you said, never let it be forgot. Once there was a Camelot, and there can be again. That's all we have to say for tonight, but we'll be back. Have a great night, everyone. See you soon.
God bless everybody.